Hello, it's John Heaton, and today I'm going to talk about George Harrison's North American tour of '74, November-December '74. Nothing officially released from it to this day. It wasn't particularly well received by some of the press. Audience reaction was mixed. But I guess the jury's still out because we haven't seen or heard a definitive audio recording of it. The only thing I have is this bootleg, live in Washington '74, which is pretty dreadful quality, as most bootlegs are, particularly live concert bootlegs. Track listing more or less what was listed in all the books. So it starts off with Harry's on tour, While My Guitar, something, then a Billy Preston song, then Sue Me, Sue You Blues, For You Blue, Give Me Love, In My Life, Tom Scott song, Maya Love, Dark Horse, What Is Life, My Sweet Lord. So it misses out the Indian section. But as I say, the quality, I listened to this in preparation for this review, and it's pretty hard going. George's voice, as we know, was suffering, and it's bootleg quality, if we're honest. So I've got a few things to show you. Maybe start off with this book. So Beatles After the Breakup is superb in its detail, of course, and it lists all of the tour dates, 45 of them. Quite a few places played 2 shows on the same day, so it starts off on Vancouver, November the 2nd, '74, then continues to Seattle, San Francisco, Oakland, 2 concerts, Long Beach, Los Angeles, 2 days of concerts and 2 concerts on each day, Tucson, Salt Lake City, Denver, St. Louis, Tulsa, Fort Worth, Houston, Baton Rouge, Memphis, Atlanta, Chicago, Detroit, the last 3 being 2 shows each, Toronto, Canada, 2 shows, Montreal, 2 shows, Boston, 2 shows, Rhode Island, Largo in Maryland, Washington, near Washington, which is where this was recorded, Nassau Coliseum, Long Island, Philadelphia, 2 shows, Madison Square Garden, 2 nights, and on the second night 2 shows. So pretty exhaustive schedule. No wonder, if you're having problems with his voice, doing that kind of level of concerts is not going to improve it. So by all accounts the voice got worse as the tour went on, I think, or maybe it just stayed on the same level. So there's been quite a lot of speculation as to whether the tour would have done better if George had gone out straight after Bangladesh in '71, and I've no doubt it would have been more successful commercially because he was riding on the back of All Things Must Pass, and his voice was in good shape then. So, and even if he'd gone out on the back of Material World in '73, I guess the results would have been more favourable. Dark Horse, not the strongest album to tour off, but not the weakest either. Some good moments on here, and his voice actually adds to the charm of that album, if that's the right word. I think it's fair to say the Indian section is perhaps too long. He gave large section of the concerts to other people, a bit like Ringo Starr and his all-star band did later on. But George, I think he did a main set of about, from what I can gather, well, it's 13 songs, so maybe an hour and a quarter, maybe hour and a half max, say 4 minutes per song. It's not going to be much more than an hour, I don't think, or maybe. But even in this track listing, he's got a Tom Scott song and a Billy Preston song. So the Indian section this is my tour program, not originally obtained, bought later, but very nice, very good to have this, and very nicely designed with the Dark Horse label, and then the pictures from the period, some lyrics from the album. That's from the record label, or similar picture to the record label with the top half of his face. Then we got the musicians, Billy Preston, Robin Ford, Chuck Findlay, Tom Scott, Andy Newmark, Willie Weeks, Emil Richards. And then this was added as a, because I presume these musicians may be added later on or were not going to feature in the tour. So a second drummer, Jim Keltner, Jim Hall on sax, and then Kumar Shankar on vocal. And then we've got this big picture of the whole group together. I think there were 17 Indian musicians featured in the Indian section. And then an appreciation of Indian music by Ravi Shankar. And then you've got technical explanations about the sitar, and then you've got all the pictures of the Indian guys at the end. And there are a lot of them. So I think maybe, and even Ravi Shankar said, you should, because the audience were clamouring for more Beatles tunes or Harrison tunes, probably Beatles tunes, knowing the audiences. And Ravi Shankar went up to George and said, look, you need to include some of your best known songs, otherwise it's not going to work. And he grudgingly did. But what he did is he included While My Guitar, which was a natural choice, Something as well. He changed the words in Something. Instead of you're asking me, will my love grow? Instead of saying I don't know, he said I hope so, because at this stage he just met Olivia, so that lyric was more true to his personal circumstances at the time. So that was okay. But then In My Life he covered the John Lennon track from Rubber Soul, and instead of saying in my life I love you more, he said I love him, capital H, more, or I love God more. I can't remember which one of the two. But and the arrangement of this song is not very good, again, on the bootleg. But whether it would have sounded better if it was remastered. I think every concert was recorded. It was anticipated to be a huge success. So every concert was videoed, recorded. So those recordings are out there. I think if someone went in, like, I don't know, Giles Martin, or it doesn't have to be Giles, someone go in and remaster them. Maybe Russ Titleman can do it, and put them out, because I think fans would like to see it. Maybe it wouldn't be the greatest concert on earth, but it would be fascinating to see it visually as opposed to just hearing this rubbish quality bootleg. This book, one of my favourite Beatles books, Bob Woofenden, The Beatles Apart, he explains why it wasn't a great success. It says he did begin to include Beatles song in his set, but invariably tampered with the lyrics, an act of sacrilege that no American audience was going to approve, not even from an ex-Beatle. In any case, it is surely one thing for George to turn around one of his own compositions so that it becomes While My Guitar Gently Smiles, but quite another for him to alter one of John's, In My Life I Love Him More. And then he goes on to say that the main problem simply seemed to be one of attitude. Any performer must have in mind, even if subconsciously, an audience to whom he is communicating, and presumably must take some precautions, however nominal, to meet the requirements of that audience. Harrison, though, seemed to have broken off diplomatic relations with his, and as such, Dark Horse simply seemed wrong. He was talking about the album, but he makes similar comments about the tour. This book, an old favourite of mine, George Harrison, Yesterday and Today, from Ross Michaels. As you can see, it's seen better days. But again, some good writing on this tour here. Says in one of the reviews, moments of real gladness were few, and the evening was filled with dissonances, contradictions, shortfalls. At show after show, Harrison urged the crowds to chant Hare Krishna or Christ Christ or Allah Allah, and at least once launched into a sermonette. If we can all do it for 30 seconds without any hang-ups, we'll blow the ceiling off this place. I don't know. I think, we could be the judge for ourselves if it was released, and, maybe we wouldn't be into the religious stuff too much, but maybe that wouldn't be the highlight of the concert. This was a good moment when he met the President, Gerald Ford, at the White House. It was one of the highlights of the tour. We've got a fine band, by the way. Where is it? Willie Weeks on bass, who would later play on Steve Winwood's first solo album, and George Harrison in '79, along with Andy Newmark, his rhythm section partner, who would play on George Harrison, and on that Steve Winwood album I mentioned, and also on Double Fantasy, and also Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking, Roger Waters, among many others. Jim Keltner was brought in as the second drummer, and the song of George's It's What You Value was written about Jim, because Jim, instead of asking for money for this concert, asked for a 450 car. Forget if it was a Mercedes or something, and someone's driving a 450 and his brakes are so wild. The lead-off line from that particular song, so that's about Jim. Tom Scott on horns, who would a few months later play on Venus and Mars on the track Listen to What the Man Said. Billy Preston, who had the unique privilege of not only playing with the Beatles on Let It Be on the roof and in the studio, toured with the Stones on the Goat's Head Soup tour and Exile tour, and I think played the organ on I've Got the Blues from Sticky Fingers as well, and then toured with George, and then played on 33 1/3 and Gone Troppo. So very lucky, fortunate gentleman, should we say. Jim Horn on sax. Peter Sellers accompanied George on the tour. There's pictures of him on the private plane. So George was a bit of a contradiction at this time in that he was preaching godliness, but his own private life was going to pot, or probably literally. It was going through a rough patch because he was splitting up with Patty, and he was using a lot of coke by all accounts, and so a slight contradiction there. But I think he was honest enough in one interview to say, but compared to most rock musicians, I'm very religious, but compared to the true religious people, I'm nothing. So he was honest enough to say that. But it's funny that the tour, all the publicity surrounding the tour ensured that this album got to number 4 in the US and didn't even chart in the UK. The whole experience, negative reaction from the critics, Rolling Stone in particular, George received quite bitterly. And on the song This Guitar Can't Keep From Crying from this album, Extra Texture, he even includes the line, learn to get up when I fall, learn to climb a Rolling Stone wall. And I don't think he ever forgave Rolling Stone for that particularly harsh judgment. I think it was called Lumbering in the Material World, and I forget the name of the editor, but it was not very complimentary about the tour. And it put George off touring for life, basically, with a brief exception in Japan when he performed some gigs in with Eric Clapton, and one-off gig in the Albert Hall in '92, which I was at, and occasionally turned up as a guest at Bob Dylan 1987 at Wembley, for example, or Eric Clapton in Guildford. One-off occasions, but basically touring was not for George. In fact, it's quite surprising he undertook this tour in the first place, because he wasn't really the commercial Beatle. But I guess his sales were healthy up until this point. This began the decline, really, for him, because Material World and All Things Past were huge smashes, and Dark Horse had not even been released when this tour started. So one can forgive him for thinking the tour would be a success, but a few things conspired against him. His voice not helping. But I think if one was in the front few rows, seeing Willie Weeks and Andy Newmark, that fine rhythm section with Billy Preston and George and Robin Ford on guitar, I think it would have been a joy. And I really think the DVD should be released. George was complaining that at the end of one of the gigs he was sitting in the empty stadium and he was looking at the bulldozers bulldozing up all the cans and the fag ends at the end of the concert, and it made him feel a bit sad. But hey, it's a rock concert, so what do you expect? I mean, people didn't really come to pray, I don't think. He seemed to have a bit of a negative attitude towards the audience. This is another negative review here from Melody Maker at the time. And then we've got the press conference in here, where he talks about how he'd rather be in a band with John Lennon but not Paul McCartney, and he'd rather have Willie Weeks on bass than Paul McCartney, which is not a friendly thing to say. Even if you thought it, it's not a very particularly friendly thing to say. I mean, I don't know, relations were quite strained between George and the other Beatles for most of the 70s, really, and beyond. But having said all that, you know, we haven't got many George concerts to in the can in terms of, you know, to look at. And in this day and age, I think things should be made available. They could certainly be remastered splendidly so that we could get the most out of the sound quality. I think there's nothing wrong with the musicianship of the bands in question. Maybe the Indian section was too long, but I think there would have been a lot of joy in watching this concert, and I would love to have it on DVD. So if Olivia and Dani want to consider it, that would be great. Otherwise, we just have this pretty horrible bootleg, which I'm sure doesn't do justice to it. So, thank you for watching. See you next time.